Section 41 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois Doyle. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 41. The Adventures of Mazin of Khorassaun, Part 2. The five sisters soon returned, and Mazin's adventures being recounted to them, they also adopted him as their brother, and he continued with these ladies, who strove to divert him, all in their power, by repeated rounds of amusements. One day they hunted, another hawked, another fished, and their indoor pleasures were varied and delightful, so that Mazin soon recovered his health, and was happy to the extent of his wishes. A year had elapsed, when Mazin, one day, riding out for his amusement to the enamelled dome supported on 4 golden columns, perceived under it the accursed magician, and with him a youth whom, like himself, he had inveigled into his snares, and devoted also to destruction. The rage of Mazin was kindled at the sight. He drew his saber, and rushing unperceived behind the sorcerer, who was in the act of flaying a camel for the purposes already described, seized him by his hair, and exclaimed, "Wretch, the judgment of heaven at length hath overtaken thee, and soon shall thy impure soul be plunged into the fire thou hast blasphemously adored." The magician struggled, but in vain. He then implored for mercy and forgiveness, but Mazin, convinced by the experience that he deserved none, struck off his head at one blow. Then, informing the intended victim, who stood near gazing with astonishment, of the wicked arts of the accursed Bahram, and of his own narrow escape from almost certain destruction, he advised the young man to remount his camel, and return to the spot where he had disembarked from the vessel, which would safely convey him back to his own country. The youth, having thanked him for his deliverance, took his leave, and Mazin returned to the palace, carrying with him the head of the magician as a trophy of his victory. He was highly applauded for his prowess by the sisters, who rejoiced in the destruction of so cruel an enemy to mankind. Many days had not elapsed after this event, when one morning Mazin and the sisters, sitting together in a gallery of the palace, observed a thick cloud of dust rising from the desert and approaching towards them. As it came nearer, they perceived through it a troop of horsemen, upon which the sisters, desiring Mazin to retire into an inner chamber, went to the gateway to inquire who the strangers might be. They were servants of the genie sultan, father of the ladies, and sent by him to conduct them to his presence, in order to attend the nuptials of a near relation. Upon his summons, the sisters prepared for the journey, and at the end of 3 days departed, assuring Mazin that they would return in a month. At taking leave, they gave him the keys of every apartment in the palace, telling him that he might open every door except one, which to enter might be attended with unpleasant consequences, and therefore had better be avoided. Mazin promised to observe their caution, and for many days was so well amused in examining the magnificent rooms and curiosities of the palace that he did not feel a wish to transgress till the forbidden door alone remained unopened. Having then nothing to divert him, he could not resist the impulse of curiosity, but unlocked the door, which opened on a marble staircase, by which he ascended to the terraced roof of the palace, from whence a most delightful prospect feasted his sight. On one side his eye was arrested by an extensive garden, in the center of which, under shady trees, was a basin of clear water, lined with gems of every color and description. He resolved to visit this enchanting object, and descending the staircase, explored his way through a long arcade, which led him at length into a garden, in which he diverted himself with the scenery it afforded for some time. He then retired to an alcove on the margin of the basin and sat down, but had not rested many moments, when to his astonishment he beheld descending from the sky a company of beautiful damsels, whose robes of light green silk floating in the air seemed their only support. Alarmed at such a preternatural appearance, he retired to the end of the alcove, from whence he watched their motions. They alighted on the brink of the water, and having thrown off their robes, stood to the enraptured view of Mazin in native loveliness. Never had he beheld such enchanting beauty, but one even more exquisitely charming than the rest attracted his gaze, and from the instant fixed the affections of his heart. They now plunged into the basin, where for some time they amused themselves by swimming, every now and then playfully dashing the water over themselves and each other. When satiated with frolic, they came out of the water, sat for some time on the verdant margin, then dressed themselves, and adjusting their robes to the air, soared aloft, and were soon far from the sight of the enamored Mazin, who followed them till his eyes could stretch no farther. Then, despairing of ever again beholding the object of his affections, he fainted on the grass, and it was some time before he recovered his senses. He returned melancholy to the palace, and spent the night in reposeless agitation. The following morning the 7 sisters returned, and she who had first welcomed him to their abode, and had ever since retained for Mazin the purest affection, ran with eagerness to inquire after his health. Great was her affliction on beholding him upon his bed, pale and apparently in a state of rapid decay. After many kind questions, to which he returned no answers, she entreated earnestly, by the vow of brotherly and sisterly adoption which had passed between them, that he would inform her of the cause of his unhappy dejection, assuring him that she would use every exertion to remove it, and gratify his wishes, be they what they might, however difficult to be obtained. Mazin, upon this, in a feeble tone, related his adventure in the garden, and declared that unless the beautiful, he supposed celestial, damsel could be obtained for him, he must die of grief. The sister bade him to be comforted, for in a short time his desires should be satisfied, which revived his spirits, and he accompanied his kind hostess to welcome home her sisters, who received him with their usual hospitality, but were grieved and alarmed at the sad alteration in his appearance, of which they inquired the reason, and were informed that it was the effect of absence from his generous patronesses. The next morning the sisters went upon a hunting excursion for 10 days. Only one, his kindest friend, remained in the palace, under pretense of attending Mazin, whose health, she said, was too delicate to bear the exercise of the chase. When the others were departed, she informed Mazin that the beautiful beings he had seen in the garden were of a race of genii much more powerful than her own, that they inhabited a country surrounded by seas and deserts, not to be approached by human exertion, that the ladies he beheld were sisters to the queen of this genii, whose subjects were entirely female, occasionally visited by male genii, with whom they were in alliance for the sake of population, and to whom all the males were sent away as soon as born. She further told him that these females had the power, from their silken robes, of soaring through the air with a flight 100 times swifter than that of any bird, that they were fond of recreating in verdant spots and bathing in the clearest waters, and that the garden he had seen them in was a favorite place of their resort, so that they would probably soon visit again. Possibly, continued she, they may recreate themselves there today. We will be on the watch, and if they appear, you must fix your eye on your favorite, mark where she places her robes, and while they are in the water, seize and conceal them, for deprived of these she cannot fly away, and you may make her your prisoner. Bring her to the palace, and endeavor by tenderness and endearing attention to gain her affection and consent to marriage. But remember, when she is in your power, to keep her robes from her, for should she regain possession of them, she would certainly return to the flying islands, and you would see her no more. Mazin and his adopted sister now repaired to the garden, and seated themselves in the alcove. Nor had they been there long when the fair genii appeared as before, descended on the margin of the basin, and all having undressed, each laying her robes by themselves, rushed playfully into the water, in which they began to swim, dive, and besprinkle playfully each other. Mazin, whose eager eye had ardently watched his beloved, swiftly but cautiously snatching up the robes of his mistress, conveyed them to the alcove unobserved by the fair bathers, who, when they had sufficiently amused themselves, quitted the water and, ascending the bank, began to dress. But how can we describe the distressful confusion of the unhappy genie whose robes had been stolen? Big tears rolled down her beautiful cheeks. She beat her bosom, tore her hair, and uttered loud shrieks, while her sisters, instead of consoling her, were concerned only for their own safety, and dressing themselves with confused haste, bade her farewell, mounted into the air, and disappeared. On their departure, Mazin and his adopted sister approached, and saluting the disconsolate genie, endeavored to console her, but for the present in vain, her mind being intent only on the sad captivity she thought awaited her, and the loss of her native country and relations. They led her gently to the palace, and Mazin, retiring respectfully, left her to the care of his adopted sister, who, by 1,000 endearments and attentions, so gained upon her that in 2 days the genie began to recover her spirits, and consented to receive Mazin as her husband, when the ladies should return from the chase. On their arrival at the palace, they were informed by their sisters of what had happened, and introduced to the fair stranger, who, diverted by their company and attentions, now scarcely regretted her captivity. Preparations were made for the nuptials, and in a short time Mazin was made happy in the possession of his beloved genie. A round of festivities succeeded their marriage, and the 7 sisters strove with each other who should by invention of new amusements make their residence among them most delightful to the happy pair. Mazin, however, now began to think of his mother and his native city with fond regret, and at length begged leave of his kind patronesses to return home, to which request they, from admiration of his filial love, though unwilling to part, consented, and a day was fixed for his departure. The time being arrived, the sisters beat their magical drum, when several camels appeared at the gates of the palace, heavily laden with the richest goods, a large sum of money, valuable jewels, and refreshments for the journey, led by proper attendants. One camel carried a splendid litter for the conveyance of his wife, and another was richly caparisoned for the use of Mazin, who, having taken an affectionate leave of his generous benefactresses, whom he promised to revisit at some future time, departed, and pursued the route back towards the seashore, where he had disembarked with the magician. On the journey nothing remarkable occurred, and on their arrival at the coast they found a vessel ready to receive them, when the wind, proving fair, a short time carried them safely to Bussorah, where Mazin had the satisfaction of finding his mother alive, though greatly wasted with constant grief and lamentation for his loss. To describe the joy of their meeting is impossible, for never was there more tender affection between parent and child than subsisted between Mazin and his mother. She seemed to gain new life from his recovery, and again to grow young. The fair genie, who was now in the way of being a mother, appeared perfectly contented in her situation, and Mazin, so unexpectedly restored to his country, was happy in the possession of all he wished. For the generous sisters had bestowed such wealth upon him that, in addition to the domestic felicity he enjoyed, he was now one of the richest persons in all of Bussorah. 3 years had rolled away in undisturbed happiness, during which the fair genie had borne him 2 sons, when Mazin thought it grateful to perform his promise to the 7 sisters, the benevolent foundresses of his good fortune. Having accordingly made preparations for his journey, he committed his wife's native robes to the care of his mother, giving her the key of a secret recess in which he had lodged them, but with a strict charge not to let the genie put them on, lest an irresistible impulse might inspire her to fly away to her own country. For though in general she had seemed contented, he had heard her now and then express a wish to be again with her own friends and species. The mother promised obedience, and Mazin, having taken an affectionate leave of her, his wife and children, with assurances of speedy return, embarked on board a vessel and pursued his voyage, which was uncommonly prosperous. On his landing he found camels waiting his arrival on the beach, for the genie ladies, by magic arts, knew of his coming, and had stationed them for his conveyance to their palace, which he reached in safety, and was received with the most affectionate welcomes and hospitality. Some time after the departure of Mazin, his wife requested her mother-in-law's permission to amuse herself at a public bath, and the old lady willingly accompanied her and the children to the most celebrated hammam in the city, which was frequented by the ladies and those of the chief personages of the court, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, then happening to be in Bussorah. When they reached the bath, there were then in it some of the principal female slaves, attendants of Zobeide, who, on the entrance of Mazin's wife, were struck by her uncommon beauty, and instantly collecting round her, rapturously gazed upon her as she was undressing. The slaves of Zobeide did not cease to admire Mazin's wife till she left the hammam, and even followed her till she entered her own house, when dusk had begun to gloom, and they became apprehensive of their mistresses being displeased at their long absence, and so it happened. Upon entering into her presence, Zobeide exclaimed, "Where have ye loitered, and what has been the cause of your unusually long stay at the hammam?" Upon which they looked confusedly at each other and remained silent. The Sultana then said in anger, "Instantly inform me of the cause of your delay," when they related the wonderful beauty of Mazin's wife, and dwelt so much upon her charms that Zobeide was overcome by curiosity to behold them. On the following day she sent for the mother of Mazin, who obeyed the summons with fear and trembling, wondering what could have made the Caliph's consort desirous of seeing a person of her inferior rank. Mazin's mother prostrated herself and kissed the feet of the Sultana, who, graciously raising her, said, Mazin, our wish is that you introduce to me your son's wife, of whose beauty I have heard such a description that I long to behold her." When the mother of Mazin heard these words, her heart sunk within her. She trembled, but dared not refuse the command of Zobeide. And she said, "To hear is to obey," after which she took leave, with the usual ceremony of prostration before the throne of the Sultana. When the mother of Mazin left the Princess Zobeide, she returned towards her own house. When she had reached it, entered to her son's wife, and said, "Our Sultana, Zobeide, hath invited thee to an entertainment." The wife of Mazin was delighted, instantly rose up, arrayed herself in the richest apparel she was mistress of, and dressed her two children in their choicest garments and ornaments. Then with them the mother of her husband and a black slave she proceeded, till they reached the palace of the Princess Zobeide, which they entered, and found her sitting in impatient expectation. They kissed the ground before her, and prayed for her prosperity. When the Sultana Zobeide beheld the wife of Mazin, her senses were confounded, her heart fluttered. She was astonished at her beauty, elegance, graceful stature, and blooming complexion, and exclaimed, "Gracious heaven, where could such a form as this have been created?" Then she seated her guests, and ordered a collation to be brought in, which was done immediately, when they ate and were satisfied. But Zobeide could not keep her eyes off the wife of Mazin of Bussorah. She kissed her, and questioned her concerning what had befallen herself and her husband. Her astonishment was redoubled on the relation of their adventures. The wife of Mazin then said, "My princess, if you are thus surprised, though you have not seen me in my native robes, how would you be delighted at my appearance in them? If, therefore, you wish to gratify your curiosity by beholding a miracle, you must command the mother of my husband to bring my country dress." Upon this, Zobeide commanded the mother of Mazin to fetch the flying robes, and as she dared not disobey the Sultana of the Caliph, she went home and speedily returned with them. Zobeide took them into her hands, examined them, and was surprised at their fashion and texture. At length she gave them to the wife of Mazin. When the wife of Mazin had received the robes, she unfolded them, and going into the open court of the palace, arrayed herself in them. Then, taking her children in her arms, mounted with them suddenly into the air. When she had ascended to about the height of 60 feet, she called out to the mother of her husband, saying, "Give my adieu, dear mother, to my lord, and tell him, should ardent love for me affect him, he may come to me in the islands of Wak al-Wak." After this speech, she soared toward the clouds, till she was hidden from their eyes and speeded to her own country. When the mother of Mazin beheld her in the air, she beat her cheeks, scattered dust upon her head, and cried aloud to the Princess Zobeide. "This is thy mischief." Zobeide was not able to answer or reprove her boldness from the excess of her sorrow and regret, which made her repent when repentance could not avail. The old lady returned in despair to her own habitation. Thus it happened to the persons above mentioned. But how was it with the affairs of Mazin? He did not cease traveling for some time, till he arrived at the palace of the Seven Sisters and paid his respects. They were rejoiced at his arrival, and inquired after his wife, when he informed them she was well, and that God had blessed him with 2 children, both sons, which added to their satisfaction. He remained with them for some time, after which he entreated their permission to depart. They took a tender leave of him, when he bade them farewell, and returned towards his own country. Nor did he halt till he arrived in safety at Bussorah. When he entered his house, he found his mother alone, mournfully weeping and lamenting what had happened in his absence. Seeing her in this state, he inquired the cause, upon which she informed him of all that had occurred from the beginning to the conclusion. When Mazin had heard the unwelcome intelligence, he cried out in an agony of distress for the loss of his wife and children, fell fainting to the ground, and forgot his own existence. His mother, on beholding his condition, beat her cheeks and sprinkled water upon his face till he came to himself, when he wept and said to his mother, "Inform me what my wife may have spoken on her departure." She repeated her farewell words, upon hearing which his distress and ardent longing for his wife and children was redoubled. He remained mournfully at home for the space of 10 days, after which he resolved upon the journey to the islands of Wak al Wak, distant from Bussorah 150 years of travel. Mazin departed from his mother, after he had taken leave and entreated her prayers for his success. But the aged matron was so affected that she ordered her tomb to be prepared, and did nothing but weep and lament night and day for her son, who did not halt till he had reached the palace of the Seven Sisters. When they saw him, they were surprised, and said to one another, "There must be some urgent cause for his returning so speedily." They saluted him and inquired after his affairs, upon which he informed them of the desertion of his wife, what she had said at going away, and of his resolves to travel to the islands of Wak al Wak. The 7 ladies replied, "This expedition is impossible to be accomplished either by thee or any of thy race, for these islands are distant 150 years' journey, so that thou canst not live to reach them." Mazin exclaimed, "My attempting it, however, is incumbent upon me, though I may perish on the road. If God has decreed my reunion with my wife, I shall meet her again. But if not, I shall die and be received into the mercy of the Almighty." The sisters did not cease to importune him to lay aside the journey, but it was impossible for him to obey them or remain at ease, upon which their grief for his situation increased. They knew that the distance was such as he could never overcome by human aid or rejoin his wife, but they respected his ardent love for her and his children. On this account they consulted with one another on how to assist him on the journey. He remained with them a month, but unable to repose or enjoy their entertainments. The sisters had 2 uncles, one named Abd al-Qudus, and the other Abd al-Salib, who lived at 3 months' distance from them, to whom they wrote in recommendation of Mazin as follows: "The bearer is our friend, Mazin of Bussorah. If you can direct him how to reach the islands of Wak al Wak, assist him, but if not, prevent him from proceeding, lest he plunge himself into destruction. At present he will not attend to our advice or reproofs, from excess of love to his wife and children, but through you there may finally occur to him safety and success." When they had sealed this letter, they gave it to Mazin, and bestowed also upon him of water and provisions what would suffice for 3 months' consumption, laden upon camels, and a steed for his conveyance, upon which he took leave of them with many thanks, fully restored to pursue his journey to the islands of Wak al Wak. With much pain and difficulty he pursued his journey, nor had he any pleasure either in eating or drinking during the 3 months of his pilgrimage. At length he reached a verdant pasture, in which was a variety of flowers, flocks of sheep, and cattle feeding. It was indeed a paradise upon earth. In one part of it he perceived a pleasant eminence, on which were buildings. He advanced to them and entered a court. Within it he beheld a venerable-looking personage, his beard flowing to his middle, whom he saluted. When the sage returned his compliments, welcomed him with respectful demeanor, and congratulated him on his arrival. He seated him, and laid before him a collation, of which they both ate till they were satisfied. End of section 41.